passed out. I don't know. We're trying to find some life. A few males and females have been shot. Upon that, there's like 500 people.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are going diving into a case that's really kind of captivating and chilling, the case of Rebecca Brown and David Carrington. From the outside, they seem like the perfect couple, but as we're going to uncover, things were very far from idyllic underneath.
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating about this case is it kind of shines a light on the blurred lines between love, obsession, and control. We hear about toxic relationships all the time. But this deep dive, I think, really gives us a real-life example of how those warning signs can escalate into some pretty devastating consequences.
Yeah, for sure. It's almost like a psychological thriller, but in reality. And you know what really struck me? The initial signs of Rebecca's possessiveness were almost, relatable. Like wanting to know where David was, checking his phone occasionally. Haven't we all felt that little twinge of wanting to keep tabs on someone we care about? Where does that healthy interest, cross over into something darker?
It's a great question, and it's one that I think a lot of our listeners can probably relate to. And you're right, it is often a very subtle shift. What may start as something that seems like innocent curiosity can morph into something much more insidious. And in Rebecca's case, it seems like those urges, those initial, almost understandable urges, grew into a need to control David's every move.
Yeah, it's like that saying, right? A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I guess in this case, that knowledge was about David's life. And Rebecca's desire to possess that knowledge completely became her undoing.
Precisely. And this is where I think the concept of obsessive personality comes into play. It's not simply being interested in somebody. It's about that interest becoming all-consuming, to the point where it distorts reality. And it fuels this need to control the other person completely.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. This idea of an obsessive personality. I think a lot of people, they hear that and think, well, I get obsessed with things all the time, like a new TV show or a hobby. But we're talking about something a lot deeper and a lot more complex here, right?
Oh, absolutely. When we talk about obsessive personality in a clinical sense, we're looking at a pattern of behavior that is characterized by preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and control. And it gets to the point where it really interferes with their daily life and relationships.
So it's not just about liking things a certain way. It's about needing that control, needing it to feel secure, almost like their whole world depends on it.
Yeah.
And that's where the danger lies, especially in relationships, right?
Exactly. Healthy relationships thrive on trust, independence, allowing each person to kind of be their own individual while still being part of a couple. But somebody with an obsessive personality might struggle with those concepts and instead seek to almost merge their identity with their partners, to control them as an extension of themselves.
Which brings us back to Rebecca and David. As we go deeper into their story, we're going to see how this need for control really manifests in Rebecca's actions. At first, it was subtle things like checking David's messages, questioning him all the time about his day, even showing up unannounced at his work or social gatherings.
And these behaviors, while seemingly insignificant on their own, actually form a pattern of control and isolation. What's the underlying message that you think Rebecca's sending with these actions?
It's like she's saying, I need to know everything about you, and I need to limit your interactions with anyone else. It's almost like she was trying to shrink his world down to just her.
And it's a classic tactic that's used by people with these obsessive tendencies. It's about limiting their partner's outside influences, making them more dependent, more isolated, and therefore much more susceptible to that control.
It's heartbreaking because, from what we've gathered, David was a very social guy, someone who thrived on connecting with others. But with Rebecca kind of constantly hovering, it seems like his social circle started to dwindle.
And this is where the reactions of friends and family, I think, become so crucial, because they're often the first ones to notice those red flags, to see how one person in the relationship is becoming increasingly isolated, and their personality is seemingly changing.
Yeah. It's that classic, losing themselves in the relationship scenario. But it often has a much more sinister undercurrent. And sadly, that's exactly what started happening with David. His friends noticed how uncomfortable they felt around Rebecca, how he seemed to be withdrawing from their social circle.
And that discomfort, that sense that something is off, it's often our intuition, it's screaming at us, trying to tell us that something isn't right. It's so important to pay attention to those gut feelings, both for ourselves and our loved ones. If you sense that a friend is becoming isolated or their personality seems to be changing under the influence of a partner, it's really crucial to reach out, express your concern. and let them know that you're there for them.
Such an important point. We can't underestimate the power of just checking in on our friends, letting them know that we're a safe space if they need to talk. But in David's case, it seems like things were spiraling pretty quickly. And that isolation just fueled Rebecca's obsession even further. The more she controlled his world, the more possessive she became.
It's a vicious cycle. The isolation just feeds the obsession, and the obsession demands further isolation. And as this dynamic intensified, Rebecca's jealousy just began to spiral out of control. She started accusing David of cheating, even though there was absolutely no evidence to support her claims.
Can you imagine the toll that takes on someone's well-being to constantly be under suspicion, to have your every move questioned and your integrity doubted? It must have been absolutely exhausting for David, not to mention the emotional damage that those accusations can inflict.
Absolutely. It's a form of emotional abuse, plain and simple. And what's even more insidious is how the abuser will often use apologies and promises of change to manipulate the victim, making it much harder for them to leave the relationship. It's a classic cycle of abuse. Tension builds the abuse occurs, followed by a honeymoon phase of apologies and promises, which eventually gives way to the tension building again.
So David was trapped in this cycle of suspicion, accusations, and apologies. It's no wonder that he started withdrawing further, both from his friends and from his own sense of self.
And this, unfortunately, is where the story takes a really dark turn. David, desperate to break free from this toxic dynamic, finally decides to end the relationship. But for Rebecca, whose world revolved entirely around David, this rejection was simply unacceptable. It triggered a cascade of emotions that ultimately led to a fatal confrontation at her apartment.
Oh, wow. This is where it gets really intense.
So before we kind of left off, we were talking about David's decision to end the relationship. And for someone like Rebecca, consumed by this obsession and this desperate need for control that could be perceived as a true existential threat.
Yeah, it's like her whole world was about to crumble. And that feeling of, utter devastation for someone with this obsessive personality can lead to some pretty extreme, even violent reactions. It's a stark reminder that, even though we might see red flags in a relationship, we can never truly predict how someone's going to react when they're pushed to their limits.
That's a really important point, and I think it highlights how crucial it is to take those warning signs seriously, not just for our own well-being, but also for the safety of everyone that's involved. If you're in a situation where you feel threatened or unsafe, it's so important to reach out for help and to remove yourself from that environment.
For sure. But let's go back to that night. David went to Rebecca's apartment to break things off, probably hoping for a clean break, a chance to start over. What happened next?
Well, according to reports, Rebecca initially appeared calm, maybe even resigned to the situation. But beneath the surface, there was this storm of emotions brewing. The fear of abandonment, the inability to cope with rejection. These are all very powerful triggers for somebody with an obsessive personality type. Their entire sense of self-worth is often so deeply intertwined with the object of their obsession that losing that object can feel like they're losing a part of themselves.
It's almost like a switch flipped in her mind. One minute she's calm, and the next she's lashing out, unable to process, that pain of rejection.
Exactly, and that's the danger of obsession. It can just completely hijack rational thought, leading to actions that are completely out of character. In Rebecca's case, that pent-up rage, that desperate need to regain control, it culminated in a violent attack on David.
So from a seemingly calm conversation to a sudden eruption of violence, it's a chilling reminder of how quickly things can escalate when obsession really takes hold. But let's be clear here. This wasn't just a heated argument that got out of hand. This was a deliberate and brutal attack fueled by this all-consuming obsession.
And the details of that attack, as outlined in police reports and court documents, are really disturbing. Rebecca, in a fit of rage, grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stabbed David multiple times.
A knife. So it wasn't just a physical altercation. This was a premeditated act of violence, driven by, this complete loss of control. It's hard to comprehend the level of desperation and despair that must have been swirling inside of her in that moment.
It's important to remember that while we can analyze these psychological factors that might have contributed to Rebecca's actions, we can never fully understand what was going through her mind at that moment. What we can say is that her obsession, her inability to cope with rejection, ultimately led her to commit this horrific act that took David's life and shattered countless others.
It's a tragic reminder that unchecked obsession can have devastating consequences. Not just for the individuals who are involved, but for their families, their friends, their entire community. And in the aftermath of this tragedy, those left behind are left grappling with how could this have been prevented? questions that haunt every case like this.
Absolutely. And then those questions, I think, are crucial. Because while we can't change the past, we can learn from it. We can use this case as a catalyst for conversations about healthy relationships, about recognizing those warning signs of obsession, about intervening before it's too late.
And speaking of intervention, what happened to Rebecca after the attack? Did she try to flee the scene?
No, she didn't. When police arrived, they found Rebecca still at the apartment. She was in a state of shock, repeating over and over, "He was mine. He was mine."
Wow. It's like the reality of what she had done hadn't fully sunk in yet. She was still trapped in that delusional mindset, clinging to this idea of possession, even in the face of this horrific act.
Yeah, it's a classic example of the disassociation that can sometimes occur after a violent act, especially one that is driven by such intense emotion. It's almost as though the mind creates this protective barrier, preventing the individual from fully processing the gravity of their actions. And in Rebecca's case, that disassociation seemed to really stem from this deeply ingrained obsession, her inability to separate her identity from David's.
So she was arrested, obviously. What happened during the trial? Did her defense team try to argue that the attack was a crime of passion?
Like a momentary lapse in judgment. They did. However, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence that detailed Rebecca's escalating obsession with David. The constant calls and messages, the unfounded accusations, the attempts to control his every move. They argued that this wasn't some spontaneous act of passion, but rather the culmination of this long-standing pattern of possessive and controlling behavior.
It must have been incredibly difficult for David's loved ones to sit through that trial, to hear those details, to see how deeply troubled Rebecca was, and to know that none of it was going to bring David back.
It was undoubtedly a harrowing experience for everyone who was involved. And while the defense really attempted to paint this picture of Rebecca as a woman driven to a desperate act by love, the evidence clearly pointed to something far more sinister, a calculated pattern of manipulation and control that ultimately ended in tragedy.
So what was the verdict? Was the jury swayed by the defense's argument, or did they see through the facade of love and recognize the true nature of her actions?
The jury, after careful deliberation, found Rebecca guilty of murder. They recognized that while love might have been the initial spark, it was her all-consuming obsession, her inability to let go, that ultimately led to David's death.
It's a sobering reminder that love and obsession are two very different things. Love should empower, uplift, and liberate. Obsession, on the other hand, seeks to control, confine, and possess.
And as we've seen in this case, the consequences of mistaking one for the other can be utterly devastating. Rebecca's story serves as a stark warning, a tragic tale that underscores the importance of recognizing those red flags of obsessive behavior and seeking help before it's too late.
This has been an incredibly insightful, albeit heavy conversation. I think it's safe to say that we've all gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of love obsession and that fine line that separates them. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to shift our focus to something that's equally important: prevention. What can we as individuals and as a society do to prevent tragedies like this from happening again?
You know, it's interesting you say that because it really speaks to just how insidious obsession can be. It often disguises itself as love or concern or protectiveness. And because those feelings are often so genuine at the start, it can be really difficult to recognize when they've crossed that line into something unhealthy.
It's like that boiling frog analogy, right? If you drop a frog in boiling water, it jumps right out.
Yeah.
But if you slowly heat up the water, the frog won't notice the change until it's too late. That's what's so scary about obsession. It can creep up on you, almost imperceptibly, until you're trapped in that cycle of, control and manipulation.
Exactly. And that's why I think self-awareness is so crucial. We need to be really vigilant about our own thoughts and behaviors, question our motivations, and be honest with ourselves about, are our actions stemming from a place of love, or are they stemming from a need to control?
It's about recognizing those red flags within ourselves. Those tendencies towards jealousy, possessiveness, or a need to micromanage our partner's lives. And if we see those patterns emerging, we need to be willing to address them, seek help, break free from those destructive cycles.
Absolutely. And that help can come in so many forms. Therapy support groups, even just open and honest conversations with trusted friends or family members. I think the key is to create a safe space where we can really explore those feelings without judgment, to understand the root causes of those behaviors, and develop, healthier coping mechanisms.
And it's not just about individual responsibility either, right? We need to foster a societal shift, a culture that encourages vulnerability, empathy, open communication about mental health, We need to break down the stigma surrounding therapy, create a support system where people feel empowered to seek help without fear of shame or judgment.
Imagine a world where we are as comfortable talking about our mental health as we are our physical health. Where you can say, hey, I'm struggling with anxiety, or I'm feeling really overwhelmed, without the fear of being labeled or ostracized. I think that's the kind of environment that we need to create, a culture of compassion and understanding.
It's about recognizing that mental health is just as important as physical health, and seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. And extending that same compassion and understanding to others. If we see someone struggling, let's reach out, offer a listening ear, and encourage them to seek support.
This case, as tragic as it is, can be a catalyst for those conversations, a reminder that we are all interconnected, and our actions really have a ripple effect on those around us. Let's use this as an opportunity to learn to grow and to create a more compassionate and supportive world.
Well said. And to our listeners out there, remember, you're not alone. If you're struggling with unhealthy relationship patterns, obsessive thoughts, or any other mental health challenges, please reach out for help. There are resources available, and you don't have to go through this alone.
And as always, we will be sure to include some helpful resources in the show notes for anyone who wants to explore these topics further.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, take care of yourselves and each other.